Hi, I'm Dave Atkinson, and welcome to Life on the Strait. For this great adventure series, I'll be reading from my 3-volume book, The Yonder Years. I chose not to publish it, but there are links on my channel that will take you to a cloud drive where you can freely download the PDF files. The videos in this series will be providing a little more content than what is in the book. We're now on the third section titled Stuck in a Holding Pattern. If you've been following along, we need to stay in roughly the Pacific Northwest region of the country until at least November, when one of our problem tenants is due to vacate their spaces in a little business park that we own in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Before we head off to more distant parts of the country, we will first have to find a replacement tenant. That's okay, because even though Amy and I were born and raised around Seattle, there is much of the Pacific Northwest that we had yet to experience. As this episode begins, we leave the northeast corner of Washington for a 2-week stay in Idaho's Panhandle, which includes 2 day trips into Canada, along with another day trip to Montana, before we head off to our next destination, Central Oregon. Thank you for following Life on the Strait. If you enjoy this content, please subscribe to this channel, which is free, and like and share as well. And now, the Yonder Years. On August 20th, we departed our campsite for another short drive of 63 miles to the Blue Lake RV Resort in Naples, Idaho, a small town just 7 miles south of Bonners Ferry. I'm thankful that I read some of the comments about this resort ahead of time, because several people mentioned that when you made a left turn into the resort from busy US 2, that you really had to swing wide to the right first in order to give you enough room to make a hairpin turn onto the road leading into the resort. The vehicles behind us were probably wondering why my left turn signal was flashing when I was veering well over to the right, and I'm really glad that they didn't try to pass on the left side while I was making the turn. When you are driving a car, things like this are non-issues, but with a long motorhome car combination, it was anything but routine. The campsites were very rustic. Ours had a lot of spongy tree droppings that we had to sweep out of the way to give G2's stabilization jacks some solid footing. When we tried to use the power, nothing happened. This is your basic mom and pop operation that is so common in RV parks, and Pop, who doubled as the park's electrician, was off into town. He finally returned and hunted down some cable and other parts, and soon had a very unsafe looking place for us to plug into. There was no protection from the elements, so we covered up where our plugs connected with a tarp and some rocks while we were there. We were going to be doing more from this location than the last one, given its proximity to Canada. As I previously mentioned, we couldn't take Buzzie over the border due to his non-vaccinated status, so the next best thing was to find a good RV park close to the border and then take a few day trips with a car into Canada and back. The next 2 days after we arrived, we headed south to the Sandpoint area, about a half-hour away, to do some shopping and to connect to Wi-Fi. In this case, it was at McDonald's, in order to download various software updates for our phones, computer, and iPad, plus get any emails that were in the queue. Sandpoint is a fairly large town, large enough for a Walmart store. On the 23rd, we headed north to Bonners Ferry, which is the county seat of Boundary County. It was an interesting day, as we put on several miles walking throughout the little town. We went through the tiny Boundary County Historical Museum, which offered a cornucopia of interesting exhibits, many depicting early life on the farms and wilderness. They had a mounted caribou head that Teddy Roosevelt shot back when he was 30 years old. The Kootenai, they spell it differently, river runs through the middle of town, and right next to it lied the Kootenay River Brewing Company, an excellent little brew pub where we stopped for lunch. The downtown area reminded us of Lewiston, Idaho, a sleepy little town with not much going on. Just west of town lied the Kootenai National Wildlife Refuge, so we drove over to check it out. What a beautiful place to spend the day. We witnessed a variety of bird life, and next to a big barn they had placed a large eagle's nest just so you could marvel at its size. They also had a sign depicting the wingspan of various birds, with the California condor the longest, followed by the bald eagle, red-tailed hawk, American kestrel, and finally the hummingbird. The birds were all overlaid going from the largest to the smallest, so you could easily visualize the differences. We hiked out to a bird blind, but the most interesting thing there was a dragonfly perched on a tall stalk of grass. One of my favorite photos of our adventure. There were also paved trails with squirrels scampering to and fro. One of the trails led us back to the idyllic Myrtle Falls. On the way out of the reserve, I had to pull over and snap a photo of a majestic bald eagle perched high atop a tree overlooking the lush fields of the reserve. We headed south the following day, this time to Schweitzer Mountain Ski Resort. Not as large as Sun Valley, Idaho's premier destination resort, but Schweitzer was more than just a place where the locals went to ski. Homes, cabins, and condos were in abundance as we drove towards the lodge. We rode a chairlift to the summit and then hiked a 2.5-mile circuitous route back down to the mountain's base. Greeting us as we departed the lift was a friendly little marmot or squirrel. It looked larger than a squirrel but smaller than a marmot, so I'm not sure what it was. But it just stayed put while I got its picture. The resort had other trails that wound their way along the mountainside for mountain bikers to use, and we saw several bikers negotiating those trails. This area was known for huckleberries, and they were unlike the huckleberries I was used to growing up north of Seattle that we'd find in the woods. Here the huckleberries were the size of blueberries, and they were delicious. The bears must also find them yummy, as during our hike to the bottom, we ran across several instances of huckleberry-looking bear scat. We took the next day off from sightseeing, but we did not go back into Sandpoint to dine. But we did go back into Sandpoint to dine at a very tasty Mexican restaurant called Fiesta Bonita. What we both remember about that place was the super hot salsa. Yelp came through once again. We headed up to Canada the next morning with the little tourist town of Nelson in our sights. They say that the journey is the reward, and that was certainly the case. The trip began by taking US 2 north of our campground until it branched into US 95. A little further along, State Route 1 branched off to the west, and that road headed north until it reached the border crossing. That section of State Route 1 was breathtaking, with a snake-like Kootenay River winding down in a valley to the west with mountains behind it. The views continued past the border as the highway changed to BC 21 and then BC 3A as it followed the eastern shore of Kootenay Lake. By the way, Kootenay Lake is huge, sprawling out in all directions. The Kootenay River feeds into and flows out of the lake as it heads into Idaho. Coming from Washington State, we were used to paying a fare wherever we rode a ferry. Here, the ferry was free, and it was a very nice, clean, and modern boat called the Osprey, and that's Amy's favorite bird, I should mention. A smaller ferry called the Balfour also worked this route, and we passed it near the midpoint of the trip. Balfour also happens to be the name of the town where the ferry docked, and from there we continued west on BC 3A until we headed south, crossed the bridge, and pulled into Nelson, an eclectic town full of interesting people. In other words, plenty of tattoos, body piercings, and colorful hair. Nelson was a college town close to Whitewater Ski Resort. It's also a government town with numerous impressive-looking government buildings everywhere you look. The town is famous for being the backdrop of Steve Martin's movie Roxanne. In fact, we drove to the fire station that played such a central part in the movie. A long wall in the downtown area is painted with several frames portraying that movie. We spent several hours walking the streets of Nelson, and we settled on an interesting restaurant for lunch. Outer Clove Restaurant is all about garlic. Every single thing that they offered, including desserts, was made with garlic. That night, when we returned to G2, Buzzie didn't want anything to do with us. Whichever section of the coach we were in, Buzzie went to the other. We took a different route home, heading south from town on BC 6 until it intersected with BC 3, and then traveled east where it joined the road that we took up to Nelson. When we returned, we had traveled about 240 miles. It was a long but fun day trip. The next morning, we decided to go on a 140-mile loop drive. Like the day before, we headed north on US 2 and crossed through Bonners Ferry, but this time we stayed on that highway as it turned and headed southeast into Montana. Just past the town of Troy, we headed south on State Route 56 until it met up with State Route 200, and then followed that road back to Sandpoint. US 2 followed the Kootenay River until it met up with State Route 56, and there are campgrounds and homes built close by along that stretch. The scenery was beautiful, with the river winding through meadows and valleys with mountains looming in the background. As we were heading back towards Sandpoint on State Route 200, we came upon Cabinet Gorge Dam, which was just west of the Montana-Idaho border. Construction workers were down in what looked like a turbine, either retrofitting it or performing maintenance. Far in the distance was an osprey sitting on a telephone pole holding a fish, another great photo opportunity that I took advantage of. Getting back on the road, we ended up on the eastern shore of Lake Pend Oreille. This is a huge lake, 148 square miles, and a deep lake, 1,150 feet in some regions. In fact, the Navy still conducted acoustic underwater submarine research there, and they trained sailors during World War II. There is a place to pull off the road and learn how the glaciers carved out this lake 15,000 years ago. Our next day, our business park in Coeur d'Alene needed some tending to. Our survivalist tenant vacated one of the spaces he had occupied, and one of our other tenants wanted to lease it out, seeing that it was adjacent to his space, and he could combine the two spaces so that he was renting the entire structure. In addition to combining spaces, we inked a new 4-year lease term, and we also worked with a business that took over our espresso building, getting them to sign a 1-year extension to their lease. All that was left was to get the survivalist tenant moved out of the remaining space he was leasing from us and getting a new tenant into it, but that would be over 3 months down the road. While in Coeur d'Alene, we picked up some more saline needles and lines for Buzzie, and we took care of some shopping. We also spent time with family members. On the 30th, we drove down to Sandpoint and spent the day within the city. We had lunch at an extremely popular Mexican place called Joel's. The Yelp reviews were off the charts, and the line was down the block when we arrived. Afterwards, we hiked over to City Beach, which had something for everyone. There was a large white sand beach that wrapped around City Beach Park, where people were out with their dogs and frisbees. There was also the Sandpoint RV Park, along with the Best Western Edgewater Resort. The City Beach area had a marina, a public boat ramp, plus a cruise terminal for rides around the lake. There was also a paved trail that headed north to the Cedar Street Bridge Public Market, which is a shopping mall suspended above an inlet of the lake. Combined with all the shopping, including big box stores such as Walmart and the nearby Schweitzer Mountain Ski Resort, Sandpoint looked like a great little town to call home. Our final sightseeing venture from this campsite was another excursion into Canada. This 214-mile round trip kept us on 95 all the way, US 95, CA 95, and CA 95A. Cranbrook had a population of around 25,000, but the smaller Kimberley was our destination. It resembled the Washington town of Leavenworth, a Bavarian-themed tourist town. Other than the touristy downtown area, Kimberley boasted two other attractions: the Kimberley Alpine Resort for skiing, and that was right on the edge of town, and the Underground Mining Railroad. We spent our day at the latter. The Sullivan Mine had long since been closed since they stopped mining zinc, lead, silver, and tin back in 2001. The mountain had basically been hollowed out, with over a mile of railroad tracks and elevator shafts running every which way. Today, the Underground Mining Railroad exhibit is a reenactment of what it was like. We boarded a little train that took us well into a mountain, not the Sullivan Mine Mountain, where we departed to see various depictions of mining work. A guide worked an air hammer, and all of us entered a room where the miners would go in the event of an emergency. There was much more to see, including a powerhouse that would pump air into the mine, and museum-like exhibits scattered about. It was educational as well as enjoyable. On the way back to Cranbrook, we noticed a paved path running parallel to the highway. It was called the North Star Rails to Trails Path and stretched the entire 17 miles back to Cranbrook. Kimberley is a charming little town, and much of what we saw was upscale, from the golf course to the housing developments. Cranbrook, on the other hand, was bland by comparison. It did have beautiful views of the Canadian Rockies, however. We stopped for dinner before heading home, watching Canadian football on the big screens at the Boston Pizza restaurant. I need to comment a little more about Blue Lake RV Resort. If you've ever seen the original Blues Brothers movie, keep in mind the scene in downtown Chicago where Jake and Elroy were holed up in a cheap room with an L train rumbling by directly outside the window every 10 seconds or so. Now you know what staying inside our campground is like. This was a major U.S.-Canada train corridor, and those engineers just loved to blow their whistles. It didn't matter what time of night or morning it was, the trains rumbled on by with their whistles blowing. The tracks were so close to the campground that the earth literally shook when they passed. If that wasn't enough, directly south of the campground was a sawmill and cattle farm. Non-stop sawing and non-stop mooing, and not just moo, but moo, as if they had stepped into a bear trap. The final issue was the resort's abysmal Wi-Fi. They must have connected to the internet using tin cans and string, hence our numerous trips into Sandpoint to use the Wi-Fi at McDonald's. We stayed in our campsite over the next 2 days trying to get our replacement table issue resolved. Camping World was deferring to Winnebago, and Winnebago was saying that Camping World needed to contact their technical service department. Other than that, we caught up on laundry, paperwork, and other chores. We would be sad to leave this beautiful corner of the country, but not too sad to leave Blue Lake RV Resort behind.